My name is Ethan Roswell, and I'm sitting in my study on a quiet Sunday morning, 3 months after what should have been the happiest day of my life became something else entirely. The rain taps against the windows of our small apartment near Ava's school, a gentle percussion that reminds me of simpler times. Times before I understood the weight of family expectations and the price of choosing love over legacy. But this story doesn't begin here, in this moment of reflection. It starts 6 months ago, when I slipped a simple diamond ring onto Ava Martinez's finger in the reading corner of her classroom after her students had gone home for the day. She said yes with tears in her eyes, surrounded by colorful posters about kindness and curiosity, and I thought that was all we'd need. I was wrong. The trouble began the moment we walked into the Houston Country Club to tell my parents about our engagement. The maître d' knew me by name, of course. Third-generation Roswell, tech entrepreneur, the son who'd finally made something of himself despite refusing Daddy's money. My mother, Elaine, waited at our usual corner table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her smile practiced and razor-sharp. My father, Gregory, stood when we approached, his handshake firm enough to crack knuckles, his eyes already measuring Ava like she was a business proposal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mother, Dad, I'd like you to meet Ava Martinez, I said, my hand finding the small of her back. My fiancée. The word hung in the air like smoke. Elaine's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her pale blue eyes. Gregory's grip on my shoulder tightened just a fraction too long. How wonderful, my mother said, rising to embrace Ava with the kind of hug that looks warm from a distance but feels cold up close. Tell us everything. How did you two meet? Ava, gracious as always, shared our story. How we'd met at a tech literacy workshop she'd organized at her school. How I'd volunteered to teach coding to her students. How we'd fallen in love over late-night conversations about changing the world, one kid at a time. She spoke with passion about her work, her students, her dream of opening a community center. My parents nodded at all the right moments. They asked polite questions. They ordered champagne, but I caught the glances they exchanged when they thought we weren't looking. The slight tightening around my mother's eyes when Ava mentioned growing up in East Houston. The way my father's jaw clenched when she talked about her dad working double shifts to pay for her college. A teacher, my mother said finally, as if tasting something bitter. How noble. Later, as we walked to the car, my sister Camille caught up with us in the parking lot. At 28, she'd inherited our father's sharp mind but rejected our mother's sharp tongue. Ethan, she said, pulling me aside while Ava admired the evening sky. You need to be careful. I heard what they said after you left to use the restroom. My stomach dropped. What did they say? Camille glanced toward Ava, then back to me. Mother called it Ethan's little phase. Dad said you'd come to your senses once the novelty wore off. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not surprise, exactly, but the death of hope I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. She's perfect, Camille, I whispered. I know, she said, squeezing my arm. That's exactly the problem. 2 weeks after that dinner at the country club, we sat in my parents' marble-floored living room with wedding magazines spread across the glass coffee table like battle plans. The February afternoon light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the room into territories. Ava perched on the edge of the Italian leather sofa, her notebook balanced on her knee, writing down ideas with the same careful attention she gave her lesson plans. My mother sat across from her in her throne-like armchair, flipping through pages of venues that cost more than most people's houses. Now, darling, Elaine said, her voice honeyed with false warmth, I've taken the liberty of making some calls. The River Oaks Country Club has an opening in June. It's where all the best families. Actually, Ava interrupted gently, we were hoping for something a bit more intimate. Maybe the community center where I volunteer? It has beautiful gardens, and it would mean so much to... A community center? My father's voice cut through the room like broken glass. Gregory stood by the fireplace, his brandy catching the light as he turned to stare at us. Ethan, surely you're not serious. I felt Ava's hand find mine, her fingers trembling slightly. "Dad, it's not about the venue. It's about expectations," he said, setting his drink down with a sharp click. "About maintaining certain standards. About what people will think." "What people?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Our people," my mother said, as if it were obvious. "The Hendersons, the Blackwoods, the Ashfords. These are families with history, with reputation. They'll expect a certain level." Ava's notebook slipped from her hands. As she bent to retrieve it, I caught the flash of hurt in her dark eyes, quickly hidden behind a practiced smile. "Of course," she said quietly. "I understand." But I could see that she didn't understand. Not really. How could she understand that my parents measured worth in square footage and social connections? That to them, her kindness meant nothing without a trust fund to back it up. "The River Oaks venue sounds lovely," Ava continued, her teacher's voice steady despite the tremor I knew only I could hear. "Perhaps we could incorporate some personal touches. My father makes beautiful wooden decorations, and my mother's friend is a florist who—" "Oh, how quaint," my mother said, though her smile was sharp enough to cut. "But I think we'll leave the arrangements to professionals, don't you think? After all, this is Ethan's wedding." The words hung in the air like a slap. Ethan's wedding, not ours, not Ava's. Mine alone, as if she were simply an accessory to be managed rather than the woman I loved. Later that evening, after Ava had gone home to grade papers, I lingered in my parents' study. My father sat behind his mahogany desk, reading financial reports with the intensity of a general planning a war. "She's a sweet girl, son," he said without looking up. "But you have to think practically. Marriage isn't just about feelings, it's about building something lasting. Like what you and Mom built." The words escaped before I could stop them. His eyes snapped up to meet mine. "Your mother and I have built an empire, a legacy, something that will outlast us both." "And what about happiness?" "Happiness is a luxury for people who can afford it," he said, his voice cold as winter rain. "You think that girl will make you happy when the bills come due? When the novelty wears off and you're left with someone who doesn't understand your world?" "She understands me." "No, son. She understands who you pretend to be when you're with her. But who you really are, the Roswell heir? The man who built a tech company from nothing? She'll never understand that weight, that responsibility." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Ava saw me more clearly than anyone ever had, that she loved me not despite my struggles, but because of how I'd overcome them. But standing in that study, surrounded by oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and awards for charitable donations that were really just tax write-offs, I felt the gulf between my two worlds widening like a crack in the earth. The dinner party at my parents' estate was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for both families to come together before the wedding, to find common ground. Instead, it became the night I truly understood what we were up against. Ava's parents arrived precisely on time, Manuel Martinez in his best suit, not expensive, but carefully pressed, and Lucia carrying a homemade tres leche cake that she'd spent all afternoon perfecting. They looked nervous but dignified, like diplomats entering foreign territory. My parents greeted them with the kind of politeness reserved for service staff. Polite but distant, respectful but condescending. "Mr. Martinez," my father said, shaking Manuel's hand with the briefest possible contact. "I understand you work in manufacturing." "Yes, sir," Manuel replied, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been with several companies over the years, currently involved with tech hardware." "How industrious," my mother added, though her smile never reached her eyes. "And Mrs. Martinez, what a lovely dress." The compliment was delivered like a pat on the head to a child who'd tried their best with finger paints. Dinner was a minefield. Every topic seemed designed to highlight the differences between our families. When Lucia mentioned shopping at thrift stores to find vintage decorations for their home, my mother's eyebrows arched like a drawbridge. When Manuel talked about the satisfaction of working with his hands, my father nodded with the patronizing approval of someone who'd never done manual labor in his life. But it was during dessert that things truly unraveled. My father stood, raising his wine glass, his face flushed with expensive Bordeaux and inherited arrogance. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "To Ethan," he continued, his eyes finding mine across the table, "who has always been idealistic, who has always believed in causes, and to his bride-to-be, who represents the kind of authenticity that money can't buy." The words sounded generous, but there was poison beneath the honey. Authenticity that money can't buy. As if being poor were a charming character trait rather than a circumstance. "It's not often," my father continued, his smile growing wider and more cruel, "that we see such a generous match. Ethan has always been willing to sacrifice for his beliefs." Sacrifice. The word landed like a physical blow. I saw Ava's face go very still, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Lucia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But it was Manuel who surprised me. He stood slowly, his own glass in hand, and when he spoke his voice was soft but carried an edge sharp enough to cut steel. "Thank you, Mr. Roswell," he said. "You're right about sacrifice. It's something I know quite well. I've sacrificed sleep, comfort, and pride to build something meaningful. I've sacrificed the easy path to earn what I have." He paused, his dark eyes meeting my father's. "But I've never had to sacrifice my character. That, I've found, is priceless." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's smile faltered. My mother reached for her wine with shaking fingers. Camille, bless her, began clapping slowly. "Beautiful toast, Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I couldn't agree more." Later, as we walked the Martinezes to their car, Ava was quiet, too quiet. I could see her mind working, processing what had just happened, what it meant for our future. "Your father," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "he doesn't see me as your fiancé. He sees me as your charity case." I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, to promise that things would get better, but the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. Because she wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. The bridal shop on West Gray was all white silk and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where price tags were hidden, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. I waited in the reception area, scrolling through emails and trying not to think about the credit card bill that would arrive next month. Through the gauzy curtains of the fitting room, I could hear my mother's voice, bright and animated as she held court with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Ashford, two pillars of Houston society who descended on the appointment like vultures at a feast. "Oh, it's such a romantic story," my mother was saying, her laughter tinkling like wind chimes. "My Ethan has always been so compassionate, always drawn to strays and lost causes." I looked up from my phone, a chill running down my spine. "The girl is sweet enough," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades judging people from behind charity auction paddles. "But really, Elaine, couldn't he have found someone more suitable?" "Darling, you know how young men are," my mother sighed. "They see a pretty face in a sob story, and their hearts just melt. But he'll come to his senses eventually. He always does." "Still," Mrs. Ashford chimed in, "marrying so far beneath his station? What will people think?" "Oh, we're making the best of it," my mother said, and I could practically hear her waving a dismissive hand. "The girl is getting quite the upgrade after all. From a little teacher's salary to the Roswell name, she should be grateful." My hands clenched into fists. I started to stand, to march in there and put an end to this poisonous conversation, but then I heard another voice, soft, shaking, devastated. "Excuse me." Ava emerged from behind the curtain, still wearing the wedding dress, her face pale as the silk that surrounded her. The three women fell silent, their faces reddening with the shame of being caught. I need some air," Ava said, her voice barely controlled. She brushed past me without meeting my eyes, and I heard the shop's front door chime as she fled into the Houston heat. I found her 10 minutes later, sitting on a bench outside, still in the wedding dress, her face streaked with tears she was trying desperately to hide. "Ava," I said, sitting beside her carefully, afraid she might bolt if I moved too quickly. I heard them, she whispered. I heard what she really thinks of me. Of us. She's wrong. They're all wrong. Are they? She turned to look at me, and the pain in her eyes was like a physical blow. Am I really just your charity case, Ethan? Your lost cause? No, God. No. You're everything to me. I'm what? She asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was bitterness in her voice. I'm the girl who makes you feel good about yourself? The noble teacher who reminds you that there's more to life than money? You're the woman I love, I said simply. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the traffic pass on West Gray, the wedding dress pooling around her feet like spilled milk. I've been thinking about calling this off, she said finally. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Ava, please, don't let them win. This isn't about winning, Ethan. It's about reality. I'm marrying into a family that sees me as an embarrassment. That will spend the rest of our lives waiting for you to come to your senses and trade up. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Then we'll prove them wrong. She looked at me with tired eyes. How? By pretending we don't hear the whispers? By acting grateful for their tolerance? I didn't have an answer. Because deep down I was afraid she was right. That night, Ava sat in her parents' kitchen, still wearing the wedding dress, telling them everything that had happened. Manuel listened in silence, his weathered hands folded on the table, his dark eyes growing harder with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Misha, he said finally, you don't owe anyone gratitude for the right to be loved. But what if Ethan's mother is right? What if I'm not good enough for their world? Manuel stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the small garden where he grew tomatoes and cilantro, where he'd taught Ava to plant seeds and tend growing things with patience and love. I have a story to tell you, he said quietly, about the world they think is theirs, and about the power they don't know I have. The next evening, Manuel Martinez asked if he could take me for a drive. We ended up at a small coffee shop near the ship channel, the kind of place where refills were free and the conversation was honest. Through the window, we could see the lights of the refineries, the industrial landscape that had built Houston's fortune. I want to tell you about my history with your family, Manuel said, wrapping his hands around a ceramic mug that had seen better days. I leaned forward, suddenly alert. What do you mean? 22 years ago, I was hired as a janitor at Roswell Industries, he began, his voice steady and calm. Night shift. I cleaned your father's office, emptied his trash, mopped the floors where he walked. My stomach tightened. I'd never known this. Never thought to ask about the intersection of our family's histories. Your father never looked at me twice, Manuel continued. To him, I was invisible, just part of the machinery that kept his world running smoothly. But I watched. I listened. I learned. He took a sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. I started taking business classes at the community college, learned about investments, about corporate structures. I saved every penny I could, and when your father's company went public, I bought shares. Just a few at first. Whatever I could afford. Dad never mentioned. Why would he? I was nobody to him, just the man who cleaned up after his meetings. Manuel's smile was thin but not bitter. But I was smart, Ethan. Smarter than he gave me credit for. I reinvested my dividends, bought more shares when the price dropped during the tech downturn. I studied the market, learned to read the patterns. I stared at him, beginning to understand where this was going. When smaller tech companies started struggling, I bought their shares too. Companies that supplied Roswell Industries. Companies that had contracts with your father's firm. I built a portfolio quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. Manuel, I said, my voice hoarse, what are you telling me? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, setting it on the table between us. Inside were documents, stock certificates, legal papers that made my head spin. I'm telling you that I own 51% of Roswell Industries, he said quietly, and significant stakes in 3 of your father's major suppliers. Your father works for me, Ethan. He has for the last 12 years. ever since I acquired the controlling interest. The coffee shop seemed to tilt around me. That's impossible. It's documented, legal, filed with the SEC. He gestured to the papers. I could have revealed myself years ago, could have walked into your father's office and introduced myself as his new boss. But I didn't want that power. I just wanted financial security for my family. Why are you telling me this now? Manuel's eyes hardened. Because they humiliated my daughter. Because they treated her like she should be grateful for their scraps. Because your mother stood in that bridal shop and called the woman you love a charity case. I felt something shift in my chest, a mixture of awe and terror. What are you going to do? I'm going to give them what they've given us, he said simply. The truth. At your wedding, in front of all their friends, I'm going to toast the happy couple, and I'm going to thank your parents for their years of faithful service. Manuel, if I do this, your parents will finally understand what humility feels like, he interrupted. And maybe, just maybe, they'll learn to treat people with the respect they deserve. He closed the folder and slid it back into his jacket. I'm not doing this for revenge, Ethan. I'm doing it for Ava, so she can hold her head high on her wedding day, knowing that she comes from strength, not weakness. That she brings value to your family, not the other way around. I sat in stunned silence as he stood to leave. One more thing, he said, pausing by the door. Don't tell Ava. Not yet. Let her focus on marrying the man she loves. I'll handle the rest. Outside, the lights of the refineries twinkled like fallen stars, and I understood that the balance of power in my world was about to shift in ways I never could have imagined. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and bright, Houston's June heat already shimmering off the manicured lawns of the River Oaks Country Club. I stood at the altar in my tuxedo, watching guests file into their seats like actors taking their positions for a play I wasn't sure I wanted to perform. The divide was stark and immediate. On the left side, Ava's family and friends filled 3 modest rows. Teachers from her school, neighbors from her childhood, her uncle's construction crew still wearing their good church suits. They whispered softly among themselves, voices warm with genuine affection. On the right side, my parents' guests sprawled across 8 rows of Houston's elite. Designer dresses that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Jewelry that caught the light like captured stars. Conversations about vacation homes and stock portfolios that carried across the garden like smoke. I caught fragments of their whispers as Pastor Elijah Morgan took his place beside me. Such a quaint little gathering on the bride's side, Mrs. Henderson murmured to her companion. I heard her father works with his hands, came the reply, delivered with the kind of pity usually reserved for natural disasters. My mother, resplendent in champagne silk, held court near the front. She'd positioned herself perfectly to catch the attention of every photographer, every social media post that would immortalize this day. The poor dear's getting quite the upgrade, I heard her tell a family friend. From a teacher's salary to the Roswell name. Sometimes love really is blind, isn't it? I wanted to walk over there, to tell her to stop, but then the music began and everything else faded away. Ava appeared at the end of the aisle, and my breath caught in my throat. She was radiant in her simple but elegant dress, her dark hair crowned with a delicate veil that had belonged to her grandmother. But it was her eyes that captured me. Steady, determined, beautiful, despite the pain I knew she carried. As she walked toward me, I noticed Manuel beside her, his face serene but his eyes alert, watching everything with the patience of a man who'd spent decades learning to see what others missed. Pastor Elijah began with a sermon about hidden worth, about how the most precious things in life often came disguised as ordinary gifts. His words seemed aimed directly at the assembled crowd, though his gentle voice never carried judgment. True value, he said, his eyes finding mine, is not measured by what we accumulate, but by what we give, not by what we inherit, but by what we build, not by the noise we make, but by the love we share in silence. Ava and I exchanged vows that we'd written ourselves. When she promised to love me for who I was, not who I might become, I felt something break open in my chest. When I promised to stand with her against any storm, I meant every word, even as I felt the gathering clouds of what was coming. The ceremony ended with applause that felt divided, enthusiastic from one side, polite from the other. As we walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I saw Manuel pat his jacket pocket, a small gesture that made my pulse quicken. The reception began immediately on the club's terrace, overlooking the golf course where my father had taught me to play when I was 8 years old. Round tables draped in white linen hosted conversations that flowed like separate rivers, warm and inclusive on one side, cold and exclusive on the other. During cocktails, I watched my parents work the room like politicians on election night. They introduced themselves to Ava's family with the kind of gracious condescension usually reserved for charity events. "How lovely that you could join us," my mother told Lucia, her smile bright as a camera flash. "I'm sure this is all quite overwhelming for you." "Not at all," Lucia replied with quiet dignity. "Family celebrations are always beautiful, no matter the setting." But it was during dinner that the real damage began. The clinking of silverware against crystal glasses started softly, then built to a crescendo that demanded attention. My father stood at the head table, his face flushed with wine and self-importance, commanding the room with the authority of inherited power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory began, his voice carrying across the terrace like a declaration, "it's a beautiful evening for a beautiful occasion. The joining of two families, two worlds, really." He gestured toward our table with his champagne flute, his smile wide and predatory. "My son Ethan has always been idealistic, always believed in lifting others up, in seeing potential where others might see." He paused, letting the silence build. "Limitations." The crowd chuckled, a sound like glass breaking. "But that's what makes him special, his generosity of spirit, his willingness to look beyond circumstances and see the heart beneath." Ava's hand found mine under the table, her fingers trembling. "So here's to love that transcends boundaries," my father continued, raising his glass higher, "to my son, who's always had a soft spot for those less fortunate, and to his bride, who is certainly getting the opportunity of a lifetime." The applause that followed was enthusiastic from my parents' side, stilted from Ava's. I started to stand, to say something, anything, to counteract the poison he'd just spread across our wedding reception. But then Manuel rose. Slowly, deliberately, he stood from his seat at our table, his own champagne glass in hand. The room fell silent, curious about what the bride's father might have to say. "Thank you, Mr. Roswell," Manuel began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the terrace. "You speak beautifully about generosity, about lifting others up. These are values I deeply appreciate." He walked toward the center of the room, and I noticed that Pastor Elijah was smiling slightly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "I want to tell you all a story," Manuel continued, his composure absolute, "about a young man who came to this country with nothing but dreams and a willingness to work, who took a job cleaning offices at night while he studied business during the day." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this was heading. "This young man worked for a company here in Houston, Roswell Industries, in fact. He mopped the floors, emptied the trash, watched and learned from successful people like Mr. Roswell." My father's smile began to falter. "But this young man was smart. He saved his money, invested wisely, bought shares in the company where he worked, and when other opportunities arose, he invested in those too." Manuel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, holding it up for the room to see. "Over 22 years, this young man accumulated enough shares to become the majority owner of Roswell Industries, 51% to be exact. Filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, all perfectly legal." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the manicured grass. "That young man was me," Manuel said simply. "Mr. Roswell, I want to thank you for your faithful service to my company these past 12 years. You've been an exemplary employee." My mother's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone terrace. "So when you speak about generosity," Manuel continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the space, "about lifting others up, about seeing potential. I couldn't agree more. My daughter Ava has always had those qualities. She sees worth where others see weakness, love where others see transactions. He turned to look at Ava, his eyes soft with pride. She chose to marry your son not for what he could give her, but for who he is. Not for his name or his money, but for his heart. That, ladies and gentlemen, is true generosity. Manuel raised his glass toward our table. To Ethan and Ava, may they always remember that the most valuable things in life can never be bought or inherited. They must be earned through love, respect, and the courage to see people for who they really are. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My father stormed from the terrace without a word, his face purple with rage and humiliation. My mother followed, her heels clicking against the stone like gunshots, leaving behind whispered conversations that buzzed like angry wasps. I found my parents in the club's private lounge, my father pacing like a caged animal, while my mother sat rigid in a leather chair, her perfect composure finally cracked. "Did you know?" Gregory demanded the moment I walked through the door. "Did you know about this ambush?" "Dad, how long has this been planned? How long have you been conspiring against your own family?" Quote, "I'm not conspiring against anyone," I said, finding my voice. "I'm marrying the woman I love." "You're marrying the daughter of a man who's been deceiving us for years," my mother said, her voice sharp as broken crystal. "Do you understand what this means? What people will say? What will they say, Mother, that you misjudged someone? That your precious social hierarchy isn't as solid as you thought?" "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped. "We've given you everything. Education, opportunities, connections." "You've given me expectations," I interrupted. "Rules about who I should love based on their bank account. Judgments about worth that have nothing to do with character." My father stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes cold as winter steel. "That man humiliated us in front of everyone we know." "No, Dad, you humiliated yourselves. Manuel just told the truth." "The truth?" My mother laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is that he's been lying by omission for over 20 years. What kind of man does that?" "The kind who knows that people like you would never see him for who he really is, if you knew he had power," I said. "The kind who wanted to be judged by his actions, not his portfolio." Camille appeared in the doorway, still in her bridesmaid dress, her face flushed from running. "Ethan," she said breathlessly, "Ava's looking for you. She's asking if you want to finish the reception or if you want to leave." I looked at my parents one last time. My father, red-faced and defeated. My mother, beautiful and brittle as spun glass. "I want to finish it," I said. "But not for you, for us. For the people who came here to celebrate love, not status." When I returned to the terrace, I found a transformed scene. The rigid divide between our families had dissolved. Ava's second-grade students' parents were chatting with my college friends. Manuel was deep in conversation with 3 of Houston's most prominent businessmen, who seemed genuinely fascinated by his story. Camille had taken charge of the music, and the dance floor was full of people who seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the evening. I found Ava standing by the garden's edge, looking out over the golf course where the sunset painted everything golden. "Did you know?" she asked without turning around. "Only for a few days," I admitted. "He made me promise not to tell you." "All this time," I thought. She shook her head. "I thought I was bringing nothing to this marriage except love." "That's not nothing," I said, taking her hand. "That's everything." She turned to face me, and for the first time all day, her smile was completely genuine. "Dance with me," she said. "Not because we're supposed to, but because we want to." We moved onto the dance floor, and the crowd made space for us. The song was one we'd chosen together, something soft and honest that spoke of building a life from scratch, of finding home in each other, rather than in places or things. As we swayed together, I saw Manuel and Lucia dancing nearby, their movements graceful and comfortable after 30 years of marriage. Pastor Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, nodding approvingly, as if this was exactly how he'd known the evening would end. "Your father," I whispered to Ava, "he's remarkable." "He is," she agreed, "but not because of what he owns, because of who he is." When the song ended, Manuel approached us, his face serene but his eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "May I dance with my daughter?" he asked. As they moved together, he whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her all day. When the dance ended, he pulled her close and said loud enough for me to hear, "You have always been enough, Mija. Always." The next morning, I sat in our small apartment near Ava's school, writing a letter that I'd been composing in my head for months. Outside, the Houston heat was already building, but inside, everything felt cool and clear. Dear Mother and Dad, I'm writing this not out of anger, but out of love. Love for you, love for Ava, and love for the family we're building together. Last night, you were embarrassed. You felt deceived, manipulated, humiliated in front of your friends. I understand that. But I hope you'll take some time to consider why Manuel felt the need to keep his success hidden, why he chose to let you judge him by your assumptions, rather than reveal his achievements. The man who cleaned your offices became your boss not through inheritance or connections, but through intelligence, hard work, and patience. The same qualities you claim to value, but only when they come wrapped in the right packaging. I'm resigning from the board of Roswell Industries. I'm returning the trust fund you established for me, not because I don't appreciate what you've given me, but because I want to build something with Ava that belongs to us alone. I love you both. I hope someday you'll see past your prejudices and recognize the incredible family I've married into. But whether you do or not, Ava and I will be fine. We have something you've forgotten the value of. We have each other. Your son, Ethan. Later that afternoon, Ava and I drove to the Community Literacy Center where she volunteered. We helped kids with their reading, played games in the garden, and shared pizza with families who measured wealth not in dollars, but in laughter and time spent together. As we cleaned up afterward, Camille arrived with coffee and the kind of smile that said she was choosing sides, and she'd chosen ours. "How's married life?" she asked, settling onto the center's front steps with us. "Enlightening," I said, watching Ava organize books with the same care she brought to everything she touched. "Mom called this morning," Camille said quietly. "She wanted to know if you were really giving up your inheritance." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that maybe it's time she learned the difference between having money and having worth." 3 months later, as I write this, Ava and I have settled into a rhythm that feels like home. We live simply but richly, surrounded by friends who value character over credentials, love over lineage. Manuel stepped down from active involvement in Roswell Industries last month, turning the day-to-day operations over to professional managers while maintaining his ownership. He spends his time now helping other immigrants navigate the path from janitor to entrepreneur, proving that his success wasn't luck, but replicable wisdom. My parents haven't spoken to us since the wedding. I hope they will, someday. But I've learned that love cannot be conditional on approval, and worth cannot be measured by acceptance. The wedding they thought would diminish their son actually revealed the poverty of their own values. The bride they dismissed as beneath our station lifted us to heights they never could have imagined. And every morning, as I wake up beside the woman I love in our modest apartment filled with books and dreams and the scent of her grandmother's coffee, I understand what Manuel meant when he said that the most valuable things in life can never be bought.